What kind of person calls the cops over a few fish? The kind who doesn't know she's about to lose everything. The day Karen stormed up to my farm, her designer sunglasses glinting with righteous fury, I was wrist-deep in pond muck, relocating carp to the new habitat I'd spent months building. My name's Ethan Caldwell, a third-generation farmer who traded city life for the quiet of Willow Creek, a patchwork of fields and suburbs where my family's land sat like an island in a sea of manicured lawns. The fish were my latest project, a sustainable stock for the farm's ecosystem, a small step toward reviving the land my grandfather swore would outlast us all. I'd barely scooped the first netful when Karen's voice sliced through the morning air. "You can't do that. Those fish are a nuisance. I'm calling the police." She stood at the property line, phone already in hand, her perfectly coiffed hair trembling with indignation. I wiped mud on my jeans and squinted at her. "Lady, this is my land. These fish are my business." But Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the HOA president, the self-appointed queen of Willow Creek Estates, and she'd made it her mission to civilize my unkempt farm since I'd moved in. The air was thick with summer heat, and the pond glistened under the sun, its surface rippling as carp darted beneath. Karen's tirade didn't stop. She ranted about property values, ecological balance, and how my muddy boots were an affront to the neighborhood's aesthetic. I let her talk, half amused, half annoyed, as I hauled another net of fish to the new pond. The cops arrived 20 minutes later, 2 officers, looking more embarrassed than authoritative, stepping out of their cruiser with weary sighs. "Sir, we got a call about unauthorized wildlife relocation," one said, scratching his neck. I raised an eyebrow. "Wildlife? These are carp. I'm moving them 50 feet to a pond I built. On my land." Karen, arms crossed, interjected. "It's a violation of HOA regulations. You can't just dump fish wherever you want." The officers exchanged a glance. One muttered, "Ma'am, this isn't exactly a crime scene." But Karen wasn't having it. She demanded they issue a citation, her voice climbing to a pitch that startled a nearby flock of sparrows. I leaned on my shovel, watching her performance. Karen didn't know something critical. My farm wasn't just a plot of dirt. It was the linchpin of Willow Creek's water supply. Decades ago, my grandfather had struck a deal with the town, granting the HOA access to our spring-fed reservoir in exchange for tax breaks. That reservoir fed every pristine lawn, every sparkling fountain in the estates. Without my family's land, Karen's perfectly green world would dry up. I could have told her then, could have shut her down with a single sentence, but I didn't. Not yet. I wanted to see how far she'd take this. The officers left with a warning to keep the peace, and Karen shot me a triumphant smirk before marching back to her McMansion. I tossed another fish into the pond and muttered to myself, "You just started a war you can't win, Karen." The next morning I found a certified letter taped to my gate. The HOA was fining me $500 for environmental disruption. I laughed, crumpling the paper. Karen thought she held all the cards, but she'd miscalculated. I wasn't some weekend gardener she could bully. I'd grown up on this land, knew its rhythms, its secrets. The fish weren't just a whim. They were part of a plan to restore the soil, to bring back the balance my grandfather taught me to respect. Karen's HOA, with its obsession over lawn length and mailbox colors, had no idea what it meant to work with the earth. I tossed the letter into a drawer and headed to the barn, where my irrigation system hummed quietly. A single valve, rusted but functional, controlled the flow from our reservoir to the estates. I rested my hand on it, feeling the weight of what could come next. Not yet, I thought. Let her dig her own grave. By noon, word had spread. Neighbors whispered at the edge of my property, some curious, others wary. A few supported Karen, nodding along with her complaints about that filthy farm. But others, the ones who'd lived here long enough to remember my family, stopped by with coffee and quiet encouragement. "Don't let her push you around, Ethan," said Mrs. Delaney, a widow who'd known my grandfather. "She's all bark." I nodded, but inside I was calculating. Karen's next move came faster than I expected. That evening, a tow truck rolled up, sent by the HOA to seize my old pickup for parking violations. It was parked on my own driveway, mind you, but Karen's rules didn't care about property lines. I watched the driver hook up the truck, my jaw tight. This wasn't just about fish anymore. It was personal. I called a lawyer friend, Sam, who laughed when I told him the story. She's overstepping, Ethan. The HOA has no jurisdiction over your land. You're not even a member. He promised to draft a cease and desist letter, but I wasn't ready to play that card. I wanted Karen to feel invincible, to push her luck until she crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The fish kept swimming, oblivious to the storm brewing above. I spent the evening mapping out my next steps, sketching the irrigation lines that snaked from my reservoir to the estates. Karen thought she was in control, but she'd forgotten one thing. Power isn't in the rules you write. It's in the resources you hold. As night fell, I sat on my porch, the crickets singing their endless song. The stars were bright, unclouded by the city glow that crept closer every year. I thought about my grandfather, his hands calloused from decades of tending this land. He'd warned me about people like Karen, folks who think they can control what they don't understand. I wasn't just fighting for fish or a truck. I was fighting for the life I'd chosen, the legacy I'd sworn to protect. Karen had no idea what she'd unleashed, but she was about to find out. The valve in the barn gleamed in my mind's eye, a silent promise of what was to come. The next week was a chess game, and Karen played like she'd already won. She doubled down, sending daily notices about my non-compliant farm, everything from the height of my corn to the unsightly stack of hay bales by the barn. Each letter was a jab, a reminder of her authority. I let them pile up unopened on my kitchen table. My focus was elsewhere. I'd started documenting everything. Her calls to the cops, the tow truck incident, the fines. Sam, my lawyer, had a glint in his eye when I showed him the stack. "She's building your case for you," he said. "Keep her talking." So I did. I let Karen think she was wearing me down, nodding politely when she marched over to lecture me about community standards. Inside, I was counting her moves, waiting for the right moment to strike. The twist came on a Tuesday, unexpected and sharp. I was checking the new pond's filtration system when Mrs. Delaney hobbled across the field, her face pale. "Ethan, you need to see this," she whispered, handing me her phone. It was a video, posted on the neighborhood's private social media group. Karen, standing in her pristine backyard, had filmed herself ranting about my farm, calling it a blight on our community. But it wasn't her words that hit me, it was the background. Her sprinklers were on, drenching her lawn in a wasteful arc water from my reservoir. My family's lifeblood sprayed like a status symbol. The video had dozens of likes, neighbors cheering her on. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just Karen's vendetta anymore. She'd rallied a mob. I thanked Mrs. Delaney and went back to work, but the video gnawed at me. It wasn't the insults, those I could handle. It was the realization that Karen wasn't just fighting me. She was fighting everything my farm stood for. The land, the fish, the quiet rhythm of a life tied to the earth. It was all a threat to her sterile, controlled world. That night I sat in the barn staring at the valve. I could turn it off right then, let her lawns brown and her fountains sputter. But that was too easy. I wanted her to unravel, to see her empire of rules collapse under its own weight. So I waited and I planned. By Friday, Karen escalated again. She'd convinced the HOA board to hold an emergency meeting about my farm, inviting the whole neighborhood to discuss the ongoing violations. I got the notice in my mailbox, a formal summons like I was some criminal. Sam read it and snorted. "They're bluffing. They've got no legal standing." But I saw an opportunity. I RSVP'd saying I'd attend. Karen didn't expect that. When I walked into the community center that evening, the room went quiet. 50 pairs of eyes turned to me, some curious, some hostile. Karen sat at the head of the table, her smile tight as a drum. "Mr. Caldwell, so glad you could join us," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I nodded and took a seat, my work boots leaving a faint trail of dirt on the polished floor. The meeting was a circus. Karen presented a slideshow, actually titled "The Farm Problem," with photos of my pond, my truck, even my mailbox, which she claimed was an eyesore. The crowd murmured, some nodding, others shifting uncomfortably. I let her talk, her voice rising with every slide. Then came the twist within the twist. A neighbor, a quiet man named Tom who'd lived in Willow Creek for decades, stood up. "Karen, you're wasting our time," he said, his voice steady. Ethan's family has been here longer than any of us. That reservoir you're all so proud of? It's his. You're attacking the man who keeps your lawns green. The room froze. Karen's face flushed, her mouth opening and closing like one of my carp. She hadn't known. Neither had most of the room. Tom's words shifted something. Whispers spread, heads turned. Karen tried to recover, stammering about regulations and community pride, but the tide was turning. I stayed silent, letting her flounder. When it was my turn to speak, I stood, my voice calm but firm. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to farm, same as my grandfather did. You want to talk about violations? Let's talk about how much water your sprinklers waste while my pond sustains life. I paused, meeting Karen's eyes. Or we can talk about what happens when that water stops flowing. The room went dead silent. Karen's smile was gone, replaced by a flicker of fear. I sat down, and the meeting ended in chaos, neighbors arguing, Karen shouting for order. As I walked home under the stars, I felt the weight of Tom's words. He'd given me an opening, a chance to show the neighborhood who Karen really was. But I wasn't done. The valve in the barn was still there, waiting. Karen had one more move, I was sure of it, and I'd be ready when she made it. Karen didn't waste time. By Monday, she'd filed a formal complaint with the county, accusing me of illegal water diversion and environmental endangerment. The notice arrived with a county inspector, a tired man named Greg who looked like he'd rather be fishing than dealing with HOA drama. He walked my property, clipboard in hand, while I explained the fish relocation and the pond's purpose. Looks like a solid setup, he said, peering into the water. You've got permits for this, right? I nodded, pulling out the paperwork I'd filed months ago. Greg skimmed it, then glanced at the estate's pristine lawns across the fence. This about that HOA lady? He asked, a knowing smirk tugging at his lips. I shrugged. She's got opinions. Greg shook his head and left, promising a report that would clear me. But Karen wasn't waiting for the county's verdict. She was already planning her next attack. That afternoon, I found her at my gate, flanked by 2 HOA board members, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Ethan, she said, her voice sharp as a knife, we're escalating this to a lawsuit. Your farm is a liability, and we're done tolerating it. I leaned against the gate, arms crossed. A lawsuit? For what exactly? Her eyes narrowed. For threatening the community's water supply. You said it yourself at the meeting. I laughed, a low bitter sound. Karen, I didn't threaten anything. I stated a fact. My family's reservoir keeps your fountains running. You might want to think about that before you drag this to court. Her cronies shifted uncomfortably, but Karen didn't blink. We'll see who's laughing when you're bankrupt, she snapped, turning on her heel. I watched her go, my pulse steady but my mind racing. A lawsuit was a bold move, but it was also a mistake. Karen was banking on intimidation, assuming I'd back down under the threat of legal fees. She didn't know I'd already talked to Sam, who dug into the HOA's charter and found a gold mine. Their water agreement with my grandfather was ironclad, giving me full control over the reservoir's output. If I turned that valve, the estates would be dry in days. I wasn't ready to play that card yet, but it was there, heavy in my pocket. Instead, I called a meeting of my own, not with the HOA but with the old-timers, the neighbors who'd known my family for decades. We gathered in Mrs. Delaney's living room, a cozy space filled with faded photos and the smell of fresh-baked cookies. Tom was there, along with a half-dozen others who'd watched Willow Creek change from farmland to suburbia. Karen's out of control, Mrs. Delaney said, pouring coffee. She's been bullying people for years, but this is different. She's coming for your livelihood, Ethan. I nodded, sipping the bitter brew. She thinks she can scare me off. But I've got something she doesn't. I laid out the water agreement, reading the key clauses aloud. The room went quiet, then erupted in murmurs. You could shut her down, Tom said, his eyes gleaming. Not just her, the whole HOA. I held up a hand. I don't want to hurt the neighbors. Just her. The plan took shape over coffee and cookies. We'd let Karen's lawsuit move forward. Let her spend her energy and the HOA's money. Meanwhile, I'd rally support, Not just from the old-timers but from the younger families who were starting to see Karen's reign for what it was. A power trip dressed up as community service. The twist came when Tom revealed he'd been keeping his own records. Years of Karen's petty fines, her threats, her secret deals with contractors who overcharged the HOA. She's been skimming, he said, sliding a folder across the table. Not much, but enough to make her nervous if it comes out. I stared at the documents, my mind spinning. This wasn't just about my farm anymore. It was about exposing Karen for what she was. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. Karen organized a community cleanup on my property line. A thinly veiled stunt to harass me. A dozen neighbors showed up, armed with trash bags and glares, while Karen directed them like a general. I stepped out of my barn, shovel in hand, and walked to the fence. "You're on my land," I said, my voice carrying over the crowd. Karen smirked. "This is a public service, Ethan. Your farm's a mess." I planted the shovel in the dirt, leaning on it. "Public service? Or another one of your power plays?" The crowd shifted, uneasy. I raised my voice. "You all know my family's reservoir feeds your homes. You want to keep harassing me, fine. But don't cry when your sprinklers stop working." Karen's face went white, but she recovered fast, shouting about lawsuits and violations. The crowd didn't move. They were listening to me. I turned and walked back to the barn, my heart pounding. Karen's cleanup crew disbanded within minutes, her authority crumbling under the weight of my words. That night, I sat with Tom's folder, reading through years of her misdeeds. The valve in the barn seemed to hum louder, its power growing with every page I turned. Karen had pushed too far, and now she was standing on the edge of a cliff she couldn't see. Karen's lawsuit hit like a storm, papers served by a nervous courier who avoided my eyes. The complaint was a masterpiece of exaggeration, accusing me of everything from ecological terrorism to intentional sabotage of community resources. I read it in the barn, the valve glinting in the corner like a silent co-conspirator. Sam called it a legal tantrum, but warned me it could still cost me time and money to fight. "She's betting you'll settle," he said over the phone. "She's wrong," I replied, my voice steady. I wasn't settling. I was done playing defense. Karen had built her castle on sand, and I was ready to pull the tide in. The neighborhood was fracturing. Karen's cleanup stunt had backfired, sowing doubt among her followers. Whispers about the reservoir spread, fueled by Tom's quiet campaign to share the truth. Families who'd once nodded along with Karen's rules started asking questions. Why was she so obsessed with my farm? Why hadn't anyone mentioned the water agreement before? I kept working, tending the fish, planting rows of corn, letting the tension simmer. Karen's next move was predictable. She turned up the pressure, sending inspectors from every agency she could think of: health department, zoning board, even fish and wildlife. They came, they looked, they left. My permits were airtight, my farm compliant. Each visit was a waste of her allies' time, and they were starting to notice. The twist deepened when Mrs. Delaney called me late one night, her voice trembling. "Ethan, you need to see this." She'd found an old letter in her attic, written by my grandfather to the HOA's founder. It wasn't just about the water agreement. It detailed how the HOA had promised to maintain the reservoir's infrastructure in exchange for access. They hadn't. For decades, my family had shouldered the costs, the repairs, the labor, while the estates reaped the benefits. The letter was a bombshell, proof that Karen's precious HOA was built on a broken promise. I photocopied it, sent copies to Sam and Tom, and started planning how to use it. The showdown came at the next HOA meeting, a packed event in the community center. Karen had rallied her loyalists, but the room was tense, split between her supporters and those swayed by Tom's revelations. She stood at the podium, her voice sharp as she outlined her lawsuit, painting me as a reckless outsider threatening their way of life. I waited, letting her build her case, letting the crowd absorb her venom. When she finished, I stood, holding the letter. "Karen, you talk about community," I said, my voice calm but cutting. "But your HOA's been breaking its word since before you were born." I read the letter aloud, every word landing like a hammer. The room erupted, neighbors shouting, Karen slamming her gavel for silence. She tried to pivot, claiming the letter was irrelevant, But the damage was done. Faces in the crowd turned to her, not me, their eyes hard with betrayal. I didn't mention the valve, not yet. I didn't need to. The letter had cracked her armor, and Tom's folder was about to shatter it. I handed out copies of his evidence. Receipts, emails, proof of Karen's petty corruption. The meeting dissolved into chaos, neighbors demanding answers, Karen's allies abandoning her mid-sentence. She stood alone at the podium, her face a mask of rage and panic. I walked out, leaving her to drown in her own lies. Back at the farm, I checked the pond. The fish were thriving, their scales catching the moonlight. I thought about my grandfather, how he'd fought his own battles to keep this land alive. Karen's lawsuit was still coming, but it was a desperate move, a last gasp from a woman who'd lost her grip. I could have turned the valve that night, let her world dry up, but I didn't. I wanted her to see it all fall apart first, her rules, her power, her perfect little kingdom. The valve could wait. For now, the truth was enough. Karen's empire began to crumble faster than I'd expected. The letter and Tom's evidence spread like wildfire, shared in hushed conversations and group chats. Neighbors who'd once feared her started speaking out, recounting years of her bullying. Fines for minor infractions, threats over holiday decorations, favoritism toward her allies. The HOA board, sensing the shift, distanced themselves, issuing a vague statement about reviewing internal policies. Karen's lawsuit pressed on, but it was losing steam. Sam filed a counterclaim, citing the HOA's breach of the water agreement and Karen's harassment. "We've got her on the ropes," he said, grinning over coffee. "She's fighting a war she can't win." But Karen wasn't done. She switched tactics, playing the victim. She posted tearful videos online, claiming I was bullying her. A single woman trying to protect her community. Some bought it, sending her sympathetic messages, but most saw through the act. Her lies were unraveling, and the neighborhood was waking up. I kept working, tending the farm, ignoring the occasional glares from her loyalists. The fish pond was flourishing, a small victory amidst the chaos. I'd started giving tours to curious neighbors, explaining how the carp enriched the soil, how the farm could benefit the whole community. Slowly, minds were changing. The final twist came from an unexpected source. Karen's own son, a quiet teenager named Jake. He showed up at my gate one evening, hands in his pockets, eyes downcast. "I'm sorry about my mom," he mumbled. "She's intense." I nodded, unsure where this was going. Jake hesitated, then pulled out a USB drive. "This is stuff from her computer. Emails, receipts. She doesn't know I took it." I stared at him, the weight of his betrayal sinking in. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. He shrugged, his voice barely audible. "She's hurting people. Including you." I took the drive, my mind reeling. Jake disappeared into the dusk, and I spent the night sifting through the files. It was worse than Tom's folder. Proof of Karen rigging HOA elections, funneling funds to her friends, even drafting fake complaints to justify her vendettas. I handed the drive to Sam, who called it a legal nuke. We didn't use it right away. Instead, we let Karen's lawsuit limp forward, her confidence shrinking as more neighbors turned against her. The breaking point came at a town hall, where the county presented its findings on my farm. No violations, no issues. The crowd, packed with both supporters and skeptics, waited for Karen's response. She stood, her voice shaking, and tried to spin it as a misunderstanding. Then Tom stood up, holding copies of Jake's files. "This isn't about fish," he said, his voice booming. "It's about corruption." He passed out the evidence and the room exploded. Karen fled, her face ashen, as neighbors shouted questions she couldn't answer. That night, I sat in the barn, the valve looming larger than ever. I could end it now, turn it off, let the estates feel the consequences of Karen's war. But something held me back. Jake's face, his quiet courage, lingered in my mind. He'd risked everything to stop his mother, not for me, but for what was right. I thought about my grandfather, how he'd always chosen the long road, the one that built something instead of tearing it down. I left the valve untouched and went to bed, the sound of the pond's gentle ripples carrying me to sleep. The next morning, the HOA board announced Karen's resignation. Her lawsuit was dropped, her allies scattered. The neighborhood was buzzing, not with anger but with relief. People stopped by the farm, some to apologize, others to ask about the fish. I showed them the pond, explained the cycle of life it supported. For the first time I felt like part of Willow Creek, not just the outsider with the muddy boots. Karen's fall wasn't my victory, it was the neighborhood's. With Karen gone, Willow Creek felt lighter, like a storm had passed. The HOA board scrambled to rebuild trust, holding open forums to rewrite their rules. I attended one, not to gloat but to listen. Neighbors shared stories of Karen's reign. How she'd find a single mom for a cracked mailbox. How she'd banned kids' lemonade stands for commercial activity. The room wasn't just angry. It was ready to heal. I stayed quiet, but when asked to speak I talked about the farm, the fish, the reservoir. This land's been here longer than any of us, I said. It's not just mine, it's part of Willow Creek. Let's work together to keep it alive. The applause surprised me, warm and genuine. Life settled into a new rhythm. The pond thrived, the carp growing fat and healthy. I started a small co-op, sharing fish and produce with neighbors who wanted to learn about sustainable farming. Mrs. Delaney brought her grandkids to feed the fish, their laughter echoing across the fields. Tom joined me to repair the reservoir's aging pipes, something the HOA had neglected for years. We didn't talk about Karen, but her shadow lingered, a reminder of how fragile community could be. Jake stopped by once, his shoulders less hunched, his eyes brighter. Thanks for not, using the water thing, he said. I nodded. Didn't need to. You took care of it. He smiled, a rare thing, and left. The valve stayed untouched, its power a quiet promise I hoped I'd never need. But the farm was changing Willow Creek. Families started planting gardens, inspired by the pond's success. The HOA, under new leadership, proposed a community farm project, asking for my input. I agreed on one condition: no more fines for unsightly nature. They laughed, but they agreed. The estate's lawns were still green, but now some had vegetable patches, wildflowers, even small ponds of their own. My grandfather's legacy wasn't just surviving, it was growing. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood by the pond, watching the fish glide through the water. The air was cool, the stars just beginning to peek through. I thought about Karen, wondering where she'd gone. Part of me felt sorry for her, not for her fall, but for the emptiness that must have driven her to control everything. She'd lost more than her title. She'd lost the chance to be part of something real. I didn't hate her. I just hoped she'd find peace somewhere far from Willow Creek. The farm was my home, my purpose. It wasn't just about fish or water or winning a fight. It was about building something that lasted, something that brought people together. As I turned back to the house, the pond's ripples caught the last of the sunlight, a quiet promise of tomorrow. Months later, Willow Creek was unrecognizable, not in its streets or houses but in its spirit. The community farm project took root, with neighbors volunteering to plant rows of tomatoes, beans, and sunflowers alongside my fields. Kids ran through the rows, chasing each other with muddy hands, while their parents swapped tips on composting. The HOA, now led by Tom, replaced Karen's rulebook with one that valued people over perfection. My farm wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. Families came for workshops, learning how to raise fish, grow crops, live with the land instead of against it. The reservoir, once a silent weapon, became a shared resource, its pipes maintained by a rotating crew of volunteers. I stood by the pond one morning, watching a new batch of carp settle in. Mrs. Delaney joined me, her cane sinking slightly into the soft earth. Your grandfather would be proud, she said, her voice warm. I nodded, my throat tight. He'd say it's about time we remembered what matters. She smiled, patting my arm. You reminded us, Ethan. As she walked away, I thought about the journey, the cops, the fines, the valve I never turned. It wasn't about power. It was about purpose. Karen had tried to break me, but she'd only made me stronger, made us all stronger. The fish swam in lazy circles, their world small but complete. I saw my reflection in the water, not just mine, but my grandfather's, my father's, the men who'd shaped this land before me. I'd fought for them, for the farm, for the life I believed in. And I'd won not by destroying Karen but by building something better. Willow Creek wasn't perfect, but it was alive, growing, connected. That was enough. As the sun rose higher, I walked back to the barn, the valve still there, untouched, a relic of a battle I didn't need to fight. The farm stretched out before me, green and vibrant, a testament to what we could do when we chose creation over control. I closed the barn door and headed to the fields, ready for the next day's work.